Hello, and thank you for joining today's research briefing on the right way to select digital asset management technology. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group. My colleague Jared Jingish will be on the line momentarily to walk through the heart of the presentation. But I did want to make a couple of quick announcements here as we get started. First, we will take questions towards the end of the session. So as those come to you during the presentation, please enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, for all attendees on the line today, you will be receiving a copy of today's slide deck, most likely be early next week when we get that out to you. So again, thanks for taking a few minutes. We've got a great crowd, some new names and some familiar names, so we appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to join us today. I did want to just mention a couple things about Real Story Group for those that are new to us here, and as a refresher to those that have been familiar with us for a while. But what we are is fundamentally an analyst firm, and the approach we've taken is to really help to provide you with detailed analysis of the strengths of the vendors we cover, but maybe more importantly, their weaknesses and where they fall short. And so we've developed tools to help you get to the right shortlist faster. We also actually will come on site to be an extension of your team if you ever needed some kind of consulting assistance. And we can also take you through an exercise with our RealScore application where you're benchmarking how effective your incumbent vendor is, and then we can take a look at whether you stick with that particular solution or look in a different direction. We do cover 8 different marketplaces within our research that fall under 2 larger buckets, which are digital marketing and digital workplace technology. Today we're going to be focused on digital asset management, which obviously falls under the digital marketing bucket, but here's a look at some of the other markets that we cover within our research, and we certainly would encourage you to download any of the samples from those different areas that are interesting for you. And one thing that's really near and dear to us that's critically important to our organization is the fact that we do no work for the vendors that we evaluate. So we don't speak at their conferences, we don't write white papers for them, or take any sort of money for preferential treatment within the evaluations. Our only focus is to provide you with the right solution for what it is that you're trying to do. Not rank who's best, who's worst, but really what's best for you. And so what we've done is actually incorporate that into a new book that was recently published, which our principals Tony Byrne and Jared helped to co-author. So I'm going to turn things over to Jared and let him talk about that and take it through the presentation. Jared?
Great, thank you, Scott, and thank you. I'll just reiterate what Scott said, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. We always appreciate that. And the topic today is really one that's near and dear to my heart. You know, as Scott mentioned, we just published this book, and it came out just a week ago now, called The Right Way to Select Technology. And many of the principles that we outline in that book I'll be touching on today. And you know, you can see a link there if anyone's interested in the book. If you can go there. If you are interested in buying a copy, you can just, I'm going to give you this little secret right now. If you want to just email me, I'll be happy to give you a discount code, because in conjunction with the last week's launch, we're doing we have some discount codes that we can give out for a limited time. So if anyone's interested in that, just send Scott or myself an email, and we'll get you that code as soon as possible. So with that, let's talk about the right way to select digital asset management and technology. And so why do we need to have this conversation? Well, I can tell you in the close to 20 years that I've been helping organizations select technology, it's really sad when we see organizations end up with a technology that's fundamentally the wrong fit for what they're trying to do. And we've seen organizations make mistake after mistake after mistake and waste just valuable resources, money, time, people's energy and efforts in trying to get technology to do what it's fundamentally not built to do. And so we wanted to develop a methodology that fixes that. And you know, I don't want to put the blame on all of you for making these mistakes, because many of these mistakes are caused because you're seeing so many different messages from so many different vendors. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this graphic from Scott Brinker at chiefmartech.com. He calls it the Martech 5,000. There's actually 5,000 different vendors, and I don't think it's a comprehensive list, but let's say a minimum of 5,000 different vendors trying to compete for your attention, trying to grab your money, your time, and be a part of your marketing technology toolkit. And some of these are damn vendors. Some of these call themselves damn vendors and are not damn vendors. But the point here is that it's a confusing marketplace, and you have so many options and so much noise to sift through. So we as analysts, we try to cut through some of this noise for you. And this is our vendor map that we produce on a regular basis. Really, what this aims to show is the world that we live in. These are what we think are the most significant vendors in these 8 different marketplaces that we cover, and these are the vendors that we're very closely monitoring, evaluating their strengths and weaknesses, as Scott mentioned. When it comes to DAM, we drill down even more. We think these are about 30 or so of the most significant digital asset management vendors in the marketplace. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. We're constantly watching a bit more than this 30, but these are the 30 that right now we think, again, are the most significant and that we have evaluations on. If you want to download a sample of our research, you'll see a full chapter of one of these vendor evaluations that we've produced. So let's first start this presentation about the right way to select DAM technology by talking about some of the wrong ways to select. And again, we've been doing this quite a long time. We've seen a lot of different organizations go about making some real critical errors in this process that led to them picking the wrong technology. And the first way that we see organizations falling into a bit of a pitfall is something we call blind love. And for any of you who've ever been to a technology conference or sat in on a vendor-sponsored webinar, you've seen some really slick demos from those vendors. And when you have challenges in your organizations, oftentimes you can say, "Oh, this is exactly what we need. We should bring this vendor in and talk to them about having them solve our needs." And falling in love with one particular vendor and vendor salespeople can often not give you the full picture of what's out there, and maybe there's better options that you should be considering. The second way is something we call happiness is a warm set of binders, and this is the approach where you recognize that you need new technology, and you go about putting a laundry list of every single requirement related to that technology down in an Excel spreadsheet, taking that Excel spreadsheet, putting it into an RFP, sending it over the wall, and looking for a bunch of responses from a bunch of different vendors. And anyone who's been through this knows what you get back is a big set of binders like this, and a bunch of check marks next to those requirements saying yes, 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 we can do all these things. And what we found is this is really a waste of time for everyone, and it really doesn't tell you the full story about how these vendors are going to solve your challenges. They're not necessarily lying with those check marks next to those requirements, but it doesn't give you the full explanation about how their solution is going to work for you. The next approach is something we call the My Cousin Vinny approach. I'm sure many of you, again, have attended conferences or met in peer industry groups or other types of groups where maybe you're at a dinner party at home where you're talking to your friends in other industries, and you start to tell them about some of the challenges you're having in your enterprise, and they say, "Oh, well, we had a similar problem. We chose vendor X, Y, and Z, and it worked great for us." And the point here is that what works for someone else doesn't always work for you. There is no one-size-fits-all technology out there. And even among companies in the same industry, we see different vendors being a much better fit for different organizations based on their culture, based on their skill sets, based on their types of content, based on exactly the audience that they're trying to reach. All these things very much play into finding something that is truly the right fit for you. The next wrong way is the family car approach. And I don't know about you, but when I got my license, I always thought my first car would be some nice little red sports car. But in fact, what I ended up with, the first car that I drove was something that looked very much like the minivan on the screen. And that's because that's the car my family had. And when I wanted to drive something, I drove what my family had. And I like to say sometimes this is how organizations end up managing their digital assets within something like SharePoint. Because the business recognizes the need for managing those assets, and they go to their IT department, and their IT department says, well, I understand you want to manage assets. Why don't you use SharePoint? We already have licenses to SharePoint. Try that. And that's not the best approach when it comes to digital assets, as I'm sure many of you well know. The next approach is something we call the horse race approach. And if any of you have ever been to a horse race, been to the pony, bet on the ponies at the track, you know that when you walk into that track, you get a racing form, and the racing form has a very small amount of information about each of these horses, and you're expected to plunk down your hard-earned money on one of these horses or a couple of these horses based on a very limited information. And what I liken this to is looking at some of these industry diagrams, these quadrants and waves of that are out there that are really just single snapshot views of a marketplace. And oftentimes people say, well, they're in the upper right hand of the quadrant, maybe that's who I should put on my short list. And I think you're doing a disservice if you do that, because there's a lot of situations that we've seen where vendors that are not in the upper right of a particular quadrant are in fact the best fit for certain organizations. The next method is something that we call the implementer first approach, and this is where you might be working with an agency or implementer. You might have a good relationship with them, and you say, well, can you help us pick the right technology? And it's a little bit like going to Jeep guys and asking them to help you find the right car for you. Well, of course they're going to recommend the technology that they know best. And implementers, I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, implementers really, even though they call themselves independent or vendor neutral, they're not lying there, but they really, as implementers, you can only truly know a handful of products. And I think that's, in our role as industry analysts, we're all former implementers here at Real Story Group, but we are able to take a broader view of the marketplace and evaluate more tools for your needs. And finally, the Google approach, where we're all tempted to say, okay, hey, we need digital asset management. Let's go search Google and put together a short list. I don't think that's the right approach. I think that's only the right approach if you're going to look for a search engine optimization vendor, because just picking the vendors that come up on the first or second page of Google are going to leave you with a lot of really solid technology off your list, and that's just a waste of time for everyone as well. But ultimately, when we talk about all these traditional methods, we don't want it to come down to guessing, and so the approach that I'm going to talk about next is a different way of handling this, but it's really aimed to take the guessing out of this. I want you to be very confident in who you select at the end of this process. So we have a process that we call Real Story Vendor Procurement Process, or RSVP, and this is really the basis of the methodology that we wrote about in the Right Way to Select Technology book. But it's about 20 different steps across 6 key phases, and I'm not going to go through all of these today, but really the most successful organizations do most of these steps in one way, shape, or form. But the way I'm going to talk to you about it today is thinking about technology in a way that's more akin to the principles that are most often associated with user-centered design. Now, my background is as a user experience designer before becoming an analyst, and many of the modern principles of web design or product design really we found can be applied to technology selection. So the 3 key points I'm going to highlight today is, number 1, you want this process to be holistic. So rather than really specific feature-based approach, we want you to think about encompassing the entire experience, the entire user experience from the people dealing with assets at every step of the way. We want this to be iterative in that, you know, we don't expect you to come up with the perfect set of requirements at the outset. We want you to put something on paper but refine over time through testing. And finally, we want it to be story-based. We want to emphasize user narratives and test at every step of the way based on a realistic user journeys that you lay out. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go through the next steps here. Fundamentally, what we're talking here when we talk about the right way is a winnowing down process. You know, I mentioned there's so many choices for you as buyers today, and that's good news, but the quicker we can get you to the right shortlist of possible solutions, of viable solutions, the more due diligence you can do on those shortlisted vendors to truly suss out who is the best fit for you. So that brings us to step one, which is really you have to get the right shortlist. And again, I hate to pick on my analyst brethren, but I will a little bit. You know, I think you're doing a disservice if you just look at upper right-hand quadrants of those graphics that take a single snapshot view of a marketplace. Rather, what I think you need to do is start your shortlist by finding the vendors that were fundamentally built for the use cases that you're trying to solve in your organization. Okay, so what we recommend that you do here is self-identify with a number of canonical use cases, and here we evaluate or we call out about 9 or so different use cases that we say, what are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to do basic brand management, or are you trying to do multilingual brand management? Are you trying to do multi-channel publishing? And what we found is you can usually self-identify with a few of these. Usually you're not trying to do all of these things, and what we found here is that different vendors are fundamentally good at a few of these things, not all of these things. So if we can match you up with those vendors, that's the right way to get to that first shortlist. In addition to that, is in the DAM world, we've noticed that DAM vendors are going through a period of specialization when it comes to industry. So this is not the case in all the markets that we cover, but in DAM we've seen some specialization start to happen. So what we added to our list of use case scenarios is a recognition of what industry you're in, so that we can find a product that's also aligned with that as well. So if I were to combine the vertical expertise with all of those other use case scenarios and ask you to again, self-identify, the first step for us is to spit out a short list that is truly aligned with what it is you're trying to do. And I'm showing you a screenshot here from our tool that we offer to our subscribers called Real Quadrant, which is not a single snapshot view of the marketplace. It is a marketplace view that is fundamentally aligned with what you're trying to do. Now, please don't obsess over what vendors are appearing where on this quadrant, because you don't have no idea what criteria and weightings I put behind any of these for this result set. Every real quadrant is going to be completely unique to you based on what you tell us is most important. All right, so let's assume we have the right shortlist. Now what? Now you need to test these vendors as to their suitability to your needs. And the first step that we want you to go through, and really a critical step, is to not go out and create that laundry list of every single functional requirement that you're going to need from a new DAM system. Don't start with the requirements. Start rather with some use case scenarios that really paint a picture of what it is you're trying to do. And we always say there's a bit of art and science here to creating these use cases, because you want to be descriptive as to what you're trying to do without being overly prescriptive as to how the vendor should go about solving that. Because you want to leave these a little bit open-ended so that the vendors can say, okay, I understand what these guys are trying to do. Here's how my solution can best meet those needs. But if there's one key takeaway when it comes to writing these scenarios, I always like to say that they have to be real. You have to make them as real as possible. So you want to use real personas. You want to use real environments. You want to use real examples of real content. You want to use real processes and real steps in the workflow. And if you can make that as real as possible, you're going to have a set of use case requirements that can be the basis of testing these vendors as to their fit for your needs. So once you have those scenarios and your shortlist, it's now time for the vendor demo phase. Another critical phase, and if anyone who has ever sat in a vendor demos knows that these can be a bit tricky, but the worst thing that you can do is just have vendors come in and give the same canned demonstration that they give to everyone else. Those demonstrations that always look good, that leads to that blind love that we talked about earlier. What I want you to do is use those scenarios that you created and demand that those vendors come in and demonstrate how their products meet the needs that you laid out in those scenarios. So it's going to be a much more real experience than that canned demo that they're always giving. It's a little bit harder for them, but you start to learn how willing these vendors are to jump through some hoops, and that's certainly beneficial as well. And you want these vendor demos to be really structured. So I encourage you to structure these and give the vendors instructions as to which scenarios that you want them to demonstrate, in which order, in which time frames they have to do it, so that you're able to really compare apples to apples to apples as you go through this week. And by the end of the week, it should be really obvious to you and your team as to who is the best fit for you. Some just reminders: make sure your whole team is represented. You really want to start to ask some of the tough questions during these demos, especially around pricing. We often sit in these demos with our clients and ask some of the tough questions around, hey, that module wasn't in the proposal, and how much is that going to cost, and those kind of things. But this is really where the negotiation starts to happen, and it's really powerful to have those conversations as you're learning about them and they're learning about you, so that by the time you do make a decision, you're able to really refine the cost as well as the final decision around who you're going to move forward with for an implementation. So once you get it down after that vendor demo week to ideally your 1 to 2 finalists, ideally your 2 finalists, where you can actually engage in something that we call a competitive proof of concept, or sometimes known as a bake-off. And really what we're trying to do here is mimic a real implementation project as much as you possibly can. So what I want you to do here is, usually over the course of a minimum of 2 weeks, sometimes longer, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, but you take your 2 finalists and you go back to those scenarios, and you usually give them a subset of the full list of scenarios and say, we want you to actually work with us to build these out like you would in a real implementation project. So again, we're going to use those real scenarios. This might be a really good opportunity to give them some example content that is real from your organization, and you want your people to actually do the testing of this implementation. If your IT is going to be involved with the implementation, get them involved with this. If your project management is going to be involved, get them involved, because not only are you learning what it's like to use this technology during this phase, you're learning a lot about what it's going to be like to work with this vendor and their team during this phase. This is also a good opportunity if you're going to be bringing in another third party to help you with an implementation, to get them involved at the same time, so that you're able to learn what it's like to work with them and the vendor at the same time. The pushback we always get about this phase is that it can be very resource intensive, from the vendor standpoint, but also from your team standpoint. But I can honestly say the most successful technology selections that we've ever seen are the ones that really put the effort into this final phase, because this is where it's the most real. This is where you're actually getting a chance to use the technology. It's actually getting a chance to work with the team, and there are so many lessons to be learned here. So at this point, it's time to make a decision. And you've done your testing via those scenarios when you sent out the RFP. You did the testing when you did the demos. You did the testing in the bake-off, and it should be really obvious. And you should be really certain that you're making the right decision for you, both from a technology perspective and a vendor perspective. But don't forget, you're also looking at things like how good of a fit this solution from a technology perspective. Does it fit within our environments? And then of course the always popular value fit should be a concern of everyone as well, and making sure that you're getting something that is the right size for what it is you're trying to do. And when it comes to DAM technology, I can honestly say that in today's marketplace, there's definitely more of a risk that you overbuy than you underbuy, and that's something to be aware of here. There's a lot of options ranging from some fairly cheap options, but the DAM vendors are maturing over the last few years in quite a way that they're getting more expensive and more sophisticated. So there's a lot of risk here, if nothing else, that you could find something that is overpriced and maybe more powerful than you'll ever need. For some of you, that's good. It'll give you a place to grow into, but for others, it might be overkill. And finding that right fit from a value perspective it should always be a consideration throughout this entire process. So, in summary, what we're proposing here is a deviation from the traditional method of selecting technology. And that traditional method really puts an emphasis on doing all of your requirements gathering up front, spending a bit of time on the RFP proposals and demos, leading into a big project initiation and big bang implementation. Instead, we're saying spend a little bit less time on requirements up front, spend much more time on this testing period where you're testing these vendors at various stages and through a series of more intimate interactions, so that you're very certain of who you're going to move forward with. And then spending a lot of time on that proof of concept bake-off phase, which is not throwaway by any means, because oftentimes that can lead very quickly into a live pilot where you really chunk out a first phase, so you're able to get something out there and get people to start using the system. And you learned about what these systems can do and what they can't do, and you really can start to get this system launched and out into your enterprise in a real logical way. So the idea here is that there's more value, more lessons learned, and those lessons delivered early in the process as opposed to being surprised later on. So I know we went through a lot here in a quick period of time. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop those into the questions tab. Happy to answer any of those. As that's happening, I will just summarize by saying, if there's one takeaway here, it's to test at every stage. You really just want to make this as real as possible and test at every single phase. Do not take the sales and marketing folks' word for it. You got to test. We have one question from Joshua here, and Joshua's asking, for proof of concept and demos, for proof of concept phase, is it also a good idea to send them a basic metadata model, even if we have not created one yet, so they can use that in the POC demo? And Joshua, I think that's a great suggestion. If you have something, or even if you can mock up something very simplistic that is based in reality, I think that's always a good idea. Again, I keep saying to make these things as real as possible, both from a content perspective, from a people perspective, from a process perspective. If you can give them a real metadata schema, real taxonomies to implement into these proof of concepts, that's going to give them a much better sense of what it is you're trying to do in the world that you live in. But when it comes time to the testing part of the POC, when you get your actual users involved, it's going to make it much more real for your team. And they're going to be able to picture how they're going to be able to work with this system. And I think that's a great idea to make it more real. All right, so we're just about out of time, but again, I would encourage anyone if they want to, if you want to get a sample chapter of any of our research reports, you can get a free chapter right on the Real Story Group website. I'd also encourage you to go try out the Real Quadrant tool we talked about. You know, you can go through and see the different criteria that we ask, and the different ways that we ask you to weight the different scenarios that are most important to you. And you won't get the full set of results unless you're a Real Story Group subscriber, but it'll give you a really good sense of how this works and how we recommend getting the right shortlist that can really save you a lot of time and money in the long run. Happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn, and or if you're interested in the book, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to give you that discount code I mentioned for a limited time, and happy to connect in social media or otherwise. And I always welcome feedback and suggestions, and I hope to encounter all of you in future engagements or at conferences or on social media. But once again, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you in your endeavors going forward. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.